Well, there are many voices, even non-Christian voices, who are beginning to question our cultural view of sexual freedom and beginning to ask, hey, has this view overpromised? Has it underdelivered on the promises that it's made? And these are non-Christian voices. I think from a Christian perspective, we can go further. I think that from a Christian view, we can actually say that no bigger lie has been told than the lie that sexual freedom is the source of personal happiness. In fact, your ultimate human flourishing, your personal flourishing, the flourishing of our culture is to remove any sort of boundary or barrier placed upon us by a Christian sexual ethic and actually have this ultimate freedom where we can love in any way that we want to love. And I think that this is one of the biggest lies that we have been told and that many are convinced of. And so what I want to do with today's show is I want to look at why I think that's true. I also want to look at a Christian sexual ethic and then try to show you that far from being repressive and restrictive in those negative ways, it is actually what sets us free and what leads to personal and cultural flourishing. And so that is my hope. My name is Ryan Pauly, and this is the show Think Well, where I hopefully can help you think well about the biblical view of sexuality, think well about how we as a culture have lived and the ideas and worldviews that are shaping our cultural view. And then hopefully with these two things in mind, can join them together in engaging the culture well. And so that is the hope of today's show, as well as every other show that I try to have. And so we try to have some fun conversations. I try not to teach too long, and then I can get to your questions and your comments and your objections. And so I hope that with today's topic, that even if you strongly disagree with me, that you don't think the Christian sexual ethic is one that leads to flourishing, I hope that you can still recognize when you look around and see brokenness, see regret that people have, see broken families because of sexual brokenness, see things like different Me Too movements and others where people are crying out, see headlines where religious leaders and others are creating this wake of victims of sexual sin and sexual abuse, and see this is problematic. We have to do something to think better about this and engage better because this is broken. And so I hope that no matter who you are and where you land on this, that you can agree with me on that. So that is going to be today's conversation. I look forward to talking through what I think is a biblical view. We are going to be talking through today's topic is part 3 of our culture topic, where we're walking through this book by Andrew and Christian Walker, A Parent's Guide. What do I say when? A Parent's Guide to Navigating Cultural Chaos for Children and Teens. So today is chapter 3 on sexuality. Last month was on abortion. Next month is going to be on gender. So we're walking through this chapter by chapter. If you want to get a copy and read along with me and have some better questions based on what they say, that is going to be today's topic as well as next month. And they lay out what we're going to look at today is kind of 5 to 6 major biblical teachings that should guide or inform how we think about the issue of sexuality. So that is going to be today's show. Next week, quick little look forward to see if you're new here, thanks for being here. If you're not new, thanks for being here. But I always like to start by just quickly letting you know what's coming forward, so you know what to expect from this show, and if this is something that you want to subscribe to and continue listening or downloading or whatever it is that you do. We're also walking through an apologetic series on natural theology, looking at 10 different arguments for God's existence. So next week is Chapter 2, which is argument number 1, the Leibnizian cosmological argument, which is also known as the contingency argument. So I am trudging my way through that chapter. It is a thick, deep chapter, and it is long. And so I'm working my way through it so I can kind of present the contingency argument to you and take any questions or comments, objections that you have on that argument. I do want to say that chapter 3 is the cosmological argument, authored by William Lane Craig and James Sinclair. James Sinclair is going to be joining April 15 to talk about the cosmological argument for God's existence. And then chapter 4 is authored by Robin Collins, and he wrote on the teleological design argument, and he has agreed to an interview. We just don't have a date yet. So I'm excited to say that the next 2 authors for the 2 chapters here are going to be joining me on the show after next week's Leibnizian cosmological argument. So that's something you can look forward to. And then I'm also doing a worldview series I don't have the book for this month. At the end of this month, end of March, the last show of the month is going to be March 25, looking at biblical and theological studies. So we're walking through a series called Reclaiming the Christian Intellectual Tradition of how Christians have impacted these different academic disciplines. This month is biblical and theological studies. Next month, I just got this in the mail, literally like 5 minutes ago, is looking at philosophy. So that was actually voted on by Instagram. I thought it was Christian Worldview. I went back and looked. Instagram followers in the Instagram channel voted on philosophy being the next book. I think after philosophy is the media, journalism, and communication, and then it is Christian Worldview, if I can remember off the top of my head. So that's fun. And then there's also just random off shows that come up from here from time to time on different topics. And so that is what I want to kind of walk through. And each one of these is on Tuesday. If you're listening after the fact, 'cause I had someone ask me this week, when do you go live? So if you are listening after the fact, the live show, if you want to join live and ask your questions live, the live show is every Tuesday at... Oops, I just hit the wrong thing on my computer. Sorry for a second. I'm trying to talk and do things at the same time. Every Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Pacific time is when we go live. And then what else was I going to say if you're listening after the fact? Anyways, you can also follow on social media and post your questions and engage. And if you can't, join live. So I forget what else I was going to say. Oh, yeah. And then I try to stick my teaching to like 30, 40 minutes. That leaves hopefully the last hour or so for your calls and your questions. And so when it comes to this topic of sexuality, if you're watching on YouTube, I posted 4 different videos that I've done on this topic in the past. And so hopefully I can kind of direct you over to some of those videos where I interviewed Christopher Yuan in his book, Holy Sexuality, where we laid out a biblical view of homosexuality. So if you have more specific questions on that, I would encourage you to head on over to the interview with Dr. Christopher Yuan and check out that interview that I posted there on YouTube. I also posted this interview, and I'll reference some of it today, an interview with Dr. Sean McDowell on the view, his book, Chasing Love, Sex, Love, and Relationships in a Confused Culture. That was a really interesting, really fun show. We talked about some of this aspect, how we understand these different trends or different currents in the cultural waters. And so I can direct you over to that as well. I have a show that I did on kind of how sexual freedom has hurt us, and this idea of love is love isn't love. And then I walk through kind of the barriers and boundaries that we create when it comes to sexual freedom. We'll talk a little bit about today, but I, in that video, actually walk through how I used to teach this to students and the activity that I used to do of having them kind of categorize different sexual actions as right or wrong. And then how do we draw the lines, and where do we draw the lines, and what is that line drawn based on? What foundation do we have for where we draw the lines, where we draw them? So anyways, those are the videos. Hopefully kind of can touch on different things to where that keeps today's teaching hopefully shorter and allows me more times to directly interact with your questions and your comments. So if you have questions, post them there in the live chat. Put a Q if it's directed at me at the beginning, so I know to kind of filter through quickly what you're asking me versus what you're asking other people you're interacting with in the live chat, or use the link that I posted there as well to call into the show and chat. So again, so chapter 3 of this here book, what do I say when addressing this topic of sexuality? Now, why does this matter? Why this topic? And I think you can look at it from all the different ways and say, here's why it matters. So from one side is like a Christian perspective, is that there's Christian writers like Gerald Heistan and Todd Wilson who talk about how we see this theme in culture where those who hold to a biblical view of sexuality and gender, like myself, are haters or bigots or people who should be banished to the margins of society. And I've been told things like this when I present on this at different groups. Sometimes LGBTQ people sitting in the audience are very happy and thankful for what I present. And I've shared those stories. I've also been yelled at and people storm out of the room. And so not everyone is going to view it this way, but there's definitely those who see like people who hold to a Christian view as being haters and bigots and people who should be banished. And so if you're a Christian listening to this and you're like, man, I want to stand strong for biblical sexual ethic, but there's a lot of pressures against me to abandon this, and I'm called these names, it makes it hard if we don't have a strong foundation and grounding for why we believe what we believe. It makes it very hard to then take a stand and defend the why we believe if we don't know why we believe it, or the what we believe if we don't know the why. And so I think that's one reason why this matters. Now, one of the other books I read in my first year of doctoral work was Austin Hartke's book, Austin Hartke is a transgender male, born biological female, transitioned to male, and writes in the book, forgot the name of the book, but writes that that not only are the biblical views not welcomed in the secular domain, but 1/4, Austin writes, 1/4, 25% of people raised in Christian homes who have walked away cite either the treatment or the teachings about LGBTQ people as a factor in their decision for leaving the faith. And so we have, according to Austin Harkey, 25% of people walking away from the faith and citing these teachings as being a reason. Now, I want to just say there are times where I've heard the biblical Christian sexual ethic taught in a very negative way, which I go, oh, I can see why people are very upset. And I think I've seen it taught in a way that is very beautiful. But I think one thing that we as Christians have to come to realization is we should not be so apologetic or shy for defending something that God calls good. We often don't want to talk about it. We don't want to stand up for it. It's like, man, if God calls this thing good, which I think I'll point to here in a little bit, then we should not be shy at also saying this is good and trying to present not just the truth of it, which sometimes can just be, if it's only truth, then we don't see the beauty. We don't see the goodness. And how do we give them a more robust view of it? In Catholic theologian Christopher West's book, What God Says About Our Bodies, he writes that if our bodies and sexuality proclaim a divine mystery, as Ephesians 5:32 discusses, then the enemy, he writes, would have every reason to try to keep people from recognizing the mystery of God in their bodies. Right, think about that for a second. This is why I think this topic, again, is so important, is that if Scripture, which I'm going to make a case for, presents this as a good, beautiful, wonderful thing, then we should expect, and this divine mystery of Ephesians 5, then we should expect the enemy to try to keep people from realizing how beautiful and good this is, and just see it as restrictive. And so I think these are some reasons why this matters. And so if we are, as Christians, are not catechizing, teaching, and discipling our kids in a biblical view of sexuality, then the culture will. They're seeing it everywhere. And so that is what we have to do, is kind of take that task upon ourselves and try to say, here's how we teach a biblical view. And I think the last thing here that I think they write in this book and start with, I think is helpful, is that they write cultural controversy does not mean theologically complex, right? The biblical view, often in a core sense, is not hard to discern. It is hard to obey, but it's not hard to discern. And while it is culturally controversial, it is not theologically complex. And so the question is, how do we understand the theological views of what the Bible says about gender and sexuality? And then how do we apply that to this confused culture that we live in? Now, let me jump here really quickly. Mirza, you posted a question. I'll address here before I jump into the chapter. Mirza writes, sexual freedom is not anti-Christian morality. Part of the freedom is you deciding what your morality is. The problem is when you try to impose your morality on others. Now, I think that's good. And actually that addresses the very first thing I was going to jump into. So I'm going to jump into this. Here's the issue is I think we often say, well, the problem is when you impose your morality on others. Like, all laws impose morality. We impose morality on people all the time. We create laws that say you shouldn't murder, right? We have this view that murder is wrong. We create a law that says you shouldn't murder. And when someone goes out and murders, we throw them in jail. And so we have laws like that all the time where we impose morality on others. We lock people up for sexual sins, right? When, a teacher or a pastor or some sort of leader has inappropriate relationships with someone, they get thrown in jail, especially with minors. And that is a morality we have that says any sort of sexual relationship with a minor is wrong, and therefore we're going to punish you for it, even if you think it's good. And so we are imposing morality on others. The question is, whose morality are we imposing, and why are we imposing this? Is it simply preference and opinion, or is there an actual reason? And I do talk a lot about this more in my video on how the sexual freedom has hurt us, and this idea of love is love isn't love. And I think this goes to then the first point that they make here in this book, is they address a biblical view. And the point is this, that sexuality is a gift from God. Now, why does that matter, that this is a gift from God? Well, things that are gifts mean they have to be stewarded, or they should be stewarded, right? It is not mine to do whatever I want with, but it is a gift. Therefore, I need to take care of it well. And I think this is the big first thing that we often talk about. And I've used this example all the time on my show, is that there's a video, in the video, at least, there's a guitar hanging on behind me on the wall. And if that's my guitar, I can do whatever I want with that guitar. I can smash it. I can break it. I can treat it however I want because it's mine. I bought it. It belongs to me. I am the owner. The issue, though, is that like my laptop is not my laptop. Well, I call it my laptop. It was given to me by Maven, the organization I work for. And so because that laptop was a gift from Maven, it is not mine to do whatever I want with. And I'm called to steward that. I use it well, use it how it was designed and created to be used. And if I quit or I get fired, that laptop goes back. And so I think one of the first questions we have to ask to understand this well, and where there's going to be some disagreement, is our sexuality a gift from God? Is it created by God, given to us? Therefore, it is not mine to do whatever I want to do with it, but it is mine to steward and take care of. Or is it something we invented as humans, and therefore we can do whatever we want? And that's where one disagreement is going to come from. From a biblical perspective, sexuality is a gift from God. And so when we are going to reject a biblical sexuality, we're not just rejecting or disagreeing what God did, but we're actually then rejecting the boundaries or the limits that God has set for all of creation. I think that's why it's important to go back to the creation account. And this is where we're going to see in kind of the second point, is go back to creation and say, okay, did God create this? And he did in Genesis 1 and 2, that this is something created by God, given to humans. God made us as sexual beings, and therefore we are then, and he's created these boundaries. And therefore we have to understand those boundaries, recognize that if we truly want to flourish, right, with all created things, everything that's created around us has a boundary, has a use, has a reason for which it was created to be used. And when we use it according to its design, it's going to flourish. When we use it against its design, it is going to either cause destruction or harm or render it useless. Right? A common analogy I give in a lot of talks is the analogy of the train. And I ask students and groups and adults, is a train most free when it's on the tracks or when it's off the tracks? And they always say on. It's a clear answer. I say, but the tracks are limiting. The tracks are a boundary. The tracks are restrictive and confining and make the train only go in one place. I want to free the train from the limitations of the train tracks, and I want to place it on the road. And most time groups begin to laugh. Why? Because now it's useless. It is going to sit there and rust. It was not created for the road. It was created for the tracks. So while the tracks do limit, the tracks actually set it free to do what it was created to do. And so I think that when we look at creation, and this came up in the conversation last week, is that when we look at creation, I think this is the conversation I had with James. The question is the boundary here a created boundary, or is it is the limitation because of creation that God designed it this way, or is it a barrier because of the fall? And this is a broken aspect of the world, where when my eyes don't work, that's not how God created our eyes broken, and therefore we can use science and things to fix that which is broken. But not every limitation or every boundary is a result of the fall, and some of them are designed, created boundaries. And so to look at this, I think it's helpful from this first point is to say, okay, rather than seeing ourselves in the way, in a world that God created, where we have to conform to his purposes, we're beginning to see ourselves, that we are the ultimate creator, that we are the ultimate authority in our lives. And it's increasingly easy then to imagine that reality is something, when we have this view, that we can manipulate, that we can use according to our own wills and our own desires, not as something that we need to conform ourselves to the way that God has designed it to be. And so I think that is what we then see. And so if we look at this as, this is my world to make how I want it to be, this idea of this radical expressive individualism, then we're going to see that any designed barrier by God becomes a barrier to living out our true selves. And so this then leads to that question of, what is that barrier? And so here, I think the thing I want to challenge, and then I'll get to your call, Chris, is the common analogy often given is like when you see a stop sign, like we should ask why it's there before we just pull it out. And I think, it's easy with technology around me that I don't know why certain things are, why they're there. But rather than just going, well, I don't know why it's there, let's remove it, let's throw that out, we should be asking, okay, first let me understand why it's there before I realize or make a decision whether I should remove this or not. And so I think that that's why I want to say, no matter where you are on this issue, agree or disagree with me, we should stop for a second and say, okay, why is this barrier here? Why is this biblical boundary here when it comes to our sexual freedom, before we just say, that's a negative thing, let's throw it out. And so that's where it's like, hey, stop. Maybe the stop sign's there for a good reason. Let's stop and think about it before we just go, nope, remove it, and let's move on forward with our lives. So that's the first point here, is this idea that sexuality is a good gift from God. And because it's a gift, it needs to be stewarded, not made however we want to make it. So let me jump on over here to our first caller. Chris, welcome to the show. It says that you have muted yourself. Hello. There you are. Welcome. What's on your mind?
Sorry. Okay. There is a lot.
Sure.
And I basically disagree wholeheartedly
of
what you're saying. Because I think that the quote-unquote Christian ethic of sexuality is a blatant fallacy by the church, whatever denomination it is, to keep people in line.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that if when you look at the centuries and everything that you are like looking right now, the whole political stuff that are coming out, and especially with the fact that basically the church is pinning stuff as sin, that being LGBTQ is sinful behavior just because we don't like it or whatever. And also, you are basically, when you're talking about Christian sexual ethic, you are basically obfuscating, well, you have not obfuscating, but you have to basically toe the line of just kind of obfuscating the subject of abortion. That's one of the other things. Contraception, sex education. That is one of the things that, sorry, not saying you personally, but as an institution, refuse to face the music that enacting those conservative policies, you are directly harming people with those things, with those policies. Because because when you talk about abortion, is a woman a person? Or you basically just go on to the thing about, an embryo zygote is a person and must have value more than a living, breathing person that is forced by social standards to put it out the term, but you do not account for the variable factors. Is there malformations within the fetus or the parent, or I prefer to say parent host, but yes, mother. She may have difficulty, and it's not like pregnancy is not actually an option for her, but maybe you don't know what, didn't know beforehand, so here we are. And what's the term? Non-viable pregnancies, I forgot the scientific name for it, but they also exist. This has basically been, since Roe v. Wade has essentially been collapsed as the law of the land, you're essentially all the advancements and technologies that would basically mitigate women to essentially die upon birth are basically rising. It's like reversing 100 years ago. Well, like the situation from 100 years ago.
Okay, can I jump in here really quickly? Can I respond?
Sure.
Okay, so it's just, you're kind of walking through a lot of stuff, and I just want to kind of piece through this. So first of all, Chris, thank you for calling in. I do appreciate it. it's callers like this that I really honestly do appreciate the most, because this helps, this causes us or forces us to actually think well about these issues. When we get people that disagree and push back, than people that just go, hey, yeah, everything you say is right, Ryan. That's not fun. So I appreciate it. So let me ask this. You're talking here about, so abortion was the topic of the show last month. And so we did address that way more.
Applies. It still applies.
Well, I'm not, Chris, hold on.
It applies.
I'm not disagreeing with you. Hold on. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying I spent a lot more time on that show. I'm going to address it here because it's part of the idea of sexuality. So let me just ask you this. When you made the comment that Christians refuse to face the music and care about the mother, and we often just care more about the fetus, how would you respond to the idea that there are actually more pregnancy resource centers in the United States than there are abortion clinics? And these would be privately funded pregnancy resource centers that provide therapy and counseling and training and diapers and formula, that walk alongside these women before and after birth, and even come alongside women who choose abortion. And there's more of these that are privately funded in the United States than there are abortion clinics. So how does that kind of fit into the narrative for you, at least, that Christians don't care about the women and only care about the fetus?
If Christians really cared about, sorry, I'm just trying to, if Christians really cared about all of these things, they wouldn't fight like sexual education. Access to contraception. Those things are all tied together. And also there's another thing about, like, when it comes to like preschool and stamps, and all those social programs that are funded by the government. And yet Christians never, like, I haven't never seen Christian advocating for preschool home lunch and food stamps, like, on the regular mainstream. Like that's probably just me, and I have to know I'm not American, I'm Canadian, and by comparison, those things that I'm describing are considered as health care. And so this is one of those things where, when rubber meets the road, I'm sorry, but it's you just, all right, I'll just set up right now.
Okay. Yeah. So here's what I just think is, I think that there's often an underreported and underdiscussed way in which Christians are making an impact. The millions or billions, charity is a Christian started institution. Most sociological studies show that Christians on average give well and above to charities, to homeless ministries, to these sort of things to help the poor than non-Christians do. And so when you look at sociological studies, churches and Christians do it. We just often don't blast it. So, personal story, I once was talking to a non-Christian who was blasting me and a friend of mine for discussing theology too much and not doing practical things like helping the poor. And that my friend responded and says, look, I'm not talking about how much money I give every month. And I'm not coming on my show, Chris. I'm not telling you guys how much money I give away every single month. But my friend of mine, he goes, but hold on, I'm not going to tell you how much I give away necessarily. If you want to have that private conversation, maybe. But he goes, my church last year gave over $2 million only to provide fresh water. That's not something that we often advertise. And again, if we're talking about that there are more pregnancy resource clinics in the United States that are privately funded by Christians and churches than there are government supported abortion clinics, then we actually have Christians giving overwhelmingly above and beyond to charities, to homeless ministries. I volunteer every single month at a homeless ministry that receives very, very little government support, yet is feeding families, children's, and providing an 18-month education, training, and equipping process to get people off the streets. And so I just think that these things are often not discussed. But when you look at the sociological research, Christians are overwhelmingly far and above more generous than non-Christians, according to the research.
For me, personally, it does not matter, because
but that contradicts what you just said about Christians don't care.
Please let me finish. if those funding were sent to by well funded by the government for the people at large, not just like Christian institutions and stuff, because basically all this money goes to Christian institutions, and because of those Christian institutions, they get to dictate what's their policy of like do's and don'ts. So what's got happened is that you can basically go to a hospital that is actually from that actually funded and uh, by a Christian organization, and say, "Oh, well, you wanted to book in because you're basically bleeding on the floor, and basically you want an abortion because otherwise you'll die." Well, too bad. We hold the money, so we dictate what is the policy.
Do you have an example of
So
that
this
actually
is what
happening?
I am saying. It's like
Like, do you have examples of people bleeding out, dying on the floor, and Christians going, "Nope, sorry, I hold the money. I'm
I
not going to
could
help
go
you."
with I could go with I could go with the Texas example with sorry, I'm not really good with names, that
You're
where
fine.
basically she had to jump the border basically because the judge told basically she got a she basically got a ectopic pregnancy, and she had to abort immediately, but the state wouldn't allow her, and that's just
Okay.
one of those things.
Okay.
And
So on that point,
yeah,
let me just say this: is that
there's a million
I'm
others.
oh sure, but okay, I'm with you. If there are, so for example, I would agree that an ectopic pregnancy, one in which the embryo is stuck in the fallopian tube, and if that embryo is not removed, then that is going to cause the death of the mother and of the embryo. I would agree in that case that we do have to save the life of the mother and remove that embryo, which will result in the death of that embryo. And I discussed that a little bit in
Yes.
the show last month. So if there are hospitals doing that, then I'm fully with you to say that's wrong, that shouldn't happen. But I think that these examples of maybe sometimes of people doing this doesn't get away from what I'm trying to discuss in today's show of what is the Christian ethic that we should hold. And I think it's because of a Christian ethic that
That's
says
it.
the mother is valuable and the embryo is valuable. We need to try to do what we can to care for both. And if there are instances in culture in which that's not taking, then that allows us to be able to say, this is wrong. That shouldn't have happened. We can actually hold people accountable. The question is, if the Christian view is not true, where do we get the idea of inherent human dignity and value in which what is taking place is wrong?
Look, I'm not gonna. Well, human, basically, the appealing to humanity does not need, does not require religion to basically just think like you don't have a monopoly on morality just because you have an institute like a religious institution. I'm an atheist, and also I have to be a humanist to a certain degree. Also, like existentialist and nihilist at the same time. But that does not mean that your morality that you think that you hold dictates that what I believe somehow is in a vacuum, and you know. But sorry,
You're,
let me go back a little bit. My solutions to all of this is comprehensive sexual education from the appropriate ages from school. That's one of the those parts. Second is the access to abortion, and the other thing.
okay. Get,
The other so and I promise, like, and I really like I promise you, by following all those stuff, and I'm sorry if I missed all the points here, but I promise you, you will see that teen pregnancies and unwanted pregnancies go down when you have a sufficient educated enough population to basically just take care. And it's not going to be overnight, it's going to be over decades and stuff like that. But I understand that this is contrary to the Christian faith because you need bodies to fill church or whatever reason of going back to the like all those we cannot admit to the bad policies that we enacted, so on and so forth. So
So
yeah,
Chris, that's not a fair critique because not all Christians are against sex education. In fact, I started the show by saying we should catechize, we should be teaching our kids, and we should be doing sexual education with our kids. So not all Christians are against that. And to say that we're only doing what we do to get bodies in
but
our church is not true. So
Christianity
can I
at
just ask this?
large,
Hold on a second. I haven't really cut you off.
Christianity
I
at
did once, but
large
1 second. I want to ask you
does.
one question because I have another caller and I have an entire content with the show that I do want to get through, and I normally take calls at the end, and I do want to make sure I get through my stuff. And then there's another caller waiting. Now I just want to go back to the first thing that you said. When you first called in, you said the Christian sexual ethic is just to keep people in line. Could you expand on
Yes.
that just a little bit more on what you mean and how you came to that conclusion?
Okay. So I think it's both Pope Benedict the 16th. I know that you're not from the Roman Catholic denomination, so you might basically say I don't care. It's not my Pope. But remember what he said? I think it's back in, I would say in late odd tens, 2010s. He basically told people in Africa that the only way to essentially combat AIDS is abstinence. For people, for people in that subcontinent, this is not the answer that people like for how they do things is a direct contradictory thing or unattainable thing due to how family dynamics work, how like how people survive together and all that stuff. And it's just basically that the most of the African countries there are basically poverty stricken or in the developmental country situation.
Okay, so
So
hold on a second though. Your comment was a biblical sexual ethic that sex should be between one man and one woman within the context of marriage. That you said
it could
this
be.
is just hold on. You said this is just to keep people in line. Now, whatever the Pope is doing in Africa, what he's
Is there
telling them
also
that's
the
different. So,
LGBTQ angle, and that too?
but hold on. So what I'm trying to ask is this: is that when I tell my son to not run in the road and then I stop him from running in the road, you could look at that one of two ways. You could say, wow, Ryan, you are just trying to keep your son in line. Or you could say, wow, you're trying to protect your son from something that is dangerous and harmful because you
Okay.
are a loving father, right? There's two different ways to look at it. That I'm just simply trying to control him, or actually I'm trying to teach him valuable lessons of things that will destroy him. And so the question I think, and the big thing here in the disagreement maybe is if there is no biblical sexual ethic, and the road, so to speak, in the scenario is not actually dangerous, sexual freedom is not actually dangerous, then yeah, I can see why you would say that the Christian sexual ethic is just to keep people in line. If I'm telling my son, the road is dangerous, don't run in it, but I'm making that all up, then I am lying and deceiving him to keep him in line. However, the question is, if the road really is dangerous, then I'm not lying and just trying to keep him in line. But what I'm actually doing as a loving father is protecting my son. And so if sexual freedom actually is causing destruction in society, if it is hurting families and people, then to warn people of that hurt is not just to keep them in line, but is trying to point to something that is actually harmful and lead them in a path that is good and healthy. Right. And so I think that's where the question then becomes is sexual freedom harmful or not? And that then helps us understand whether we are just lying and trying to keep people in line, or are we actually trying to warn them of something negative and lead them on a path that is healthy and one that is flourishing. Would you at least agree that that's where the disagreement is maybe? And that it's possible that Christians are not just trying to keep people in line, but trying to warn them of what we actually think is harmful?
What you could say to your son is that yes, you need to the like you cross both sides of the roads or whatever you just said to your son. Sorry, you just chopped the top a little bit. Um, but then the question that you ask is when you cross the road, what are the scenarios that is going to happen if you do this, this, and this? Or and what I'm getting at is that you constructively try to interact with this person and asking valid questions and concerns, and you explain to them why do you want this policy, but essentially the what you get with the interaction, and I'm sorry if I butchered the analogy to reiterate my point. You just say like abstinence, or just you know do the traditional thing, or whatever. But anyway, and I'm just too. I know that I'm too heated up for continuing the conversation, but it's just that the how I see things is that the secular remedy for all sorry the secular remedy is the way to do things, so for the betterment of society, to do this, because we've seen the track there is the track record of what a Christian ethic gets you, and
So,
that's it.
yeah, okay. So I'll leave it at that. I have a few more points that I think address kind of things that you're saying that are part of what I was wanting to kind of walk through. So if you want to stick around and kind of listen to that, and if there's time at the end and you want to call back in, I'd love to chat more with you about it. But I think there's a few things that are, as I'm kind of walking through, I think what I'm trying to make a case for, at least in this video, of a Christian sexual ethic, I think that kind of address some of those points. And so I'd be happy to hear your thoughts at the end if there's time. But I'm going to jump over here to James really quick. But Chris, thank you. I do appreciate your thoughts, and thanks for calling in and chat with me. I honestly do appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All righty. All right, James, let me bring you in here. Welcome back, James. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can. What's on your mind today?
Awesome. So I'm just listening. I came in late to the discussion, and as soon as I came in, I saw Chris was talking to you, and I went ahead and jumped in backstage. So I'm missing a lot of I missed the first half hour.
Okay.
So, coming in late. So what I heard was the issue of, is sexual freedom harmful? My answer to that is no. The freedom itself isn't harmful, but we can, like any freedom at all, we can abuse a freedom. And by that, I mean we can use a freedom in such a way where we do harm either to ourselves or to others. So if we're doing harm, then it's harmful. If we're not doing harm, then it's not harmful. So I can't get behind the idea that sexual freedom is harmful, because I just think it depends on how we use the freedom.
I think that's a great point. So, or a great question. So I wasn't necessarily in this video making the point that I mentioned that's a main point of a different video. The main point I was trying to say here, and what Chris had called in to discuss is actually, I made it through point 1 of 5 of my planned points that I wanted to talk through from the chapter. But the idea of, I think, understanding freedom is important. And the question is, when it comes to sexuality in a biblical view, the question is sexuality culturally constructed? Is it created? Are we in charge and we can kind of do whatever we want with? Or is sexuality a gift from God? And in a biblical view, it's a gift from God. And therefore, because it's a gift, I have to steward it well, because it's not mine. It's a gift and I need to take care of it. And so I think that was kind of the main point is, are we free to do whatever we want with this thing called sexuality? Or does God actually get to dictate how it should be done and in what context it should be done, because he is the one who created it, gave it to us, and now we're called to steward it? So that's the main point I was trying to make, is in a biblical view, it would be the gift from God that we're called to steward, not something that we can just do whatever we want with.
Right. So there's a couple of issues there. It reminds me of a quote from Penn Jillette, where he says, it just so happens I do all the killing that I want to do. It just so happens that amount is exactly 0, right? So if somebody says you shouldn't do all the killing you want to do, he's like, I already am. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Right? So, if somebody doesn't want to go do certain things that are destructive in the lives of other people, then they don't need a rule about it, right? They're just already not wanting to do the things.
Absolutely.
So, but at the same time, if you're saying, hey, isn't it great that what I call Christianity says, hey, let's not go do certain kinds of things that hurt other people, my answer is, yeah, of course that's great. That your, I don't know if you want to call it a religion, your movement, your ideology, or whatever you want to call it, that it has things that I agree with. That's wonderful. Now, for me, it's a little bit weird to refer to it as a gift and then speak as if it doesn't belong to you, right? Because I give somebody a gift, it's theirs. If I give something to someone to take care of and it's still mine, well, they're just taking care of it for me. Like they're the hired help. It's still mine. It's not a gift. Access to it could be argued as a gift, but the actual thing itself isn't really gifted, right?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, that's now just how we are going to define what a gift is. And I used the analogy before of the laptop that I do all my work on. I would call that a gift. It was gifted to me, but it was given to me by the organization I work for. And if I quit or get fired, I have to give it back. But it was nice because I didn't have to go buy my own laptop to do my work on. So it's like, man, what an incredible gift. I don't have, what an amazing gift of that you have given me this laptop. So I don't have to go buy my own to do the work. But it ultimately does belong to them, and I can't do whatever I want with that laptop, and I have to give it back if I quit. So yeah, I think that's just where we want to define what a gift is. But I would agree with the first point you made that I often tell students, and I ask them this question. I said, do you have the desire to murder your best friend? And I said that hopefully the answer is, well, clearly not. And you've never hopefully thought of that. And the reason why, and I said, look, you are fulfilling the law of Christ. The law of Christ that says don't murder. You're fulfilling that law, not because there's some sort of external set of eyes upon you and you're going, oh, I wish I could kill them, but the law says I can't. And I go to jail and that ruins my life and someone's watching, I get in trouble. It's like, no, you don't even think about that. And I use that as an example that I took from Christopher West, a theologian, that says, yeah, that's where your heart has actually been changed, where your desire for that person is to love them and not hurt them. And so that would be an example, I think, of what you're saying. Whereas if you don't have the desire to murder, that's wonderful. You are now fulfilling the law of Christ and not murdering, not because there's some sort of external rule, but because you actually have a heart that wants to help and not hurt. Then the question is, well, what do we do in the areas where our desires are contrary to the law of Christ or contrary to biblical commands? And what do we do in those instances? Do we throw out the law and say, that's dumb, I'm going to do what I want to do? Or do we find a way to conform our heart and to have our heart be reoriented and rightly ordered instead of disordered? And that would be the question that I address. But very similar, I think, to your first point that you make.
Sure. Now, so when it comes to things like killing people, we can all agree that that counts as a form of harm, right? There's no room for if we're even going to entertain that harm is a real concept, killing has to be on the list. But at the same time, when we move over to the discussion of sexual ethics, how it's okay to behave sexually, or I don't know if you were including thoughts and feelings, but at least behaviors, then we're having a different discussion at this point, because there's a lot of things that a Christian typically will say you're not supposed to do, where the reasons for that are just an appeal to authority and trust in what they think is coming from God, but it's not really rooted in or connected to don't do harm, because there are, the list of sexual activities that could harm you or someone else isn't identical to the list of things that Christians will say you're not supposed to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of. So what would you mean by harm in that, in your context?
Well, so for example, let's say, and I'm not gay, right? But I know your position on that thing. So the question is, I don't know what harm comes of gay people doing gay things together. I don't, we can say that maybe here it's God's feelings or something, or we can say that maybe God's going to punish them for it, and that's harm. But the two individuals, in the context of their physical experience, as far as I can tell, they're not harming each other.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and that's what I mean by what do we mean by harm? And because I think a lot of times we often only think of the physical component, where we harm people physically. I was at UC Berkeley one time talking to someone, and he said, do whatever you want so long as you don't hurt anybody. And I asked the question, I said, hurt them how? Because here's a question for you, James. If there is a peeping Tom, a guy sets up a video camera in a women's changing room and video records women changing. And these women come in, they change their clothes, and they leave. They have no idea that anything has ever happened. That video never makes it online. They never find out about it. Has that woman been harmed?
Right, that's a fair question. So in a real world context, we can talk about that he was risking harm to them, because it can't be sure that they won't find out. And if they do, then they will suffer psychological harm that could be durable throughout their years to come. So risking harm, I think, would be in the same category as causing harm. So,
okay, but let's say no harm ever comes to that woman. Is what that guy did wrong?
Well, again, what he did was wrong because he risked harm to them because he can't really know that they won't find out. And beyond that, if there were a plausible scenario, like, I don't know, magic or something, where there's no risk of being caught, just a thought experiment, then you could still ask the same question, and my response would have to be different, because now we're not talking about a situation where he's risking being exposed, and if there's no risk of being caught, then are the women being harmed?
So
And I would say that. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I cut you off.
So he's not harming the women in that context if they can't find out. He's risking harm if they can, even if they don't. But in a hypothetical scenario where they literally couldn't find out, he's harming himself, because by engaging in a practice that actively disrespects the healthy boundaries and healthy respect for other human beings, he's diminishing the quality of his conscience. He's diminishing himself in such a way where he's becoming less invested in the rights and interests of other people. He's not respecting other people's journey and their rights as he would want them honored for himself. So he's actually harming his own psychology, and in the process becoming a more dangerous person in ways that even he himself won't recognize until those manifests in other behaviors that will harm other people.
Okay, so it sounds like you would say that we're not just caring about physical harm here, that there's other types of ways that we can harm people, and someone does not need to know anything wrong has been done to them for that to be wrong. And so he has harmed himself. He could leave that room and be happy. He could be filled with joy, and he could say, man, that was a wonderful experience. But you're still saying that what he did was wrong, and that there's some sort of harm that was done to him as far as his conscience.
Yeah, he harmed his conscience, and what people don't recognize is when you do something that harms your own conscience, that it reduces the effective implementation of your conscience. You're just not as conscientious of a person as you were before you did the thing. It will ripple effect. It will cause secondary behaviors that manifest from the diminished conscience. Those secondary behaviors in the real world inevitably will end up hurting somebody in a very real way.
Yeah, and so I think this is a helpful point. And what it sounds like you're saying is that even if no physical harm has been done, that we can still judge a behavior as being wrong. And so that's why I think that when we look at a biblical sexual ethic, we're not simply looking at what physical harm could be done here or what physical harm was done here, but there's ways in which we can actually classify something as being wrong, even if there's not that physical harm component. And even if someone leaves something feeling happy and feeling filled with joy, by you saying they destroyed their conscience by doing something they shouldn't have done, then that was in a sense wrong for them to do. And that's where I think this is important here is to say, when it comes to a sexual ethic, God's not just commanding things as wrong that do physical harm to others, but there's ways in which we can destroy our conscience, and we can actually devalue people by the way we use them for our pleasures versus appreciating them for the valuable thing that they are. The person becomes an end to a means rather than the means in and of itself. And therefore, even though both people are consensual, if I'm using someone for only my sexual pleasure and they become an object for my pleasure, not they are the end of themselves, but a means to the end, then I am misusing that person, and therefore that is wrong, even if it's consensual and we're both happy. Could that not also, would that fit within what you're saying?
Well, to be clear, I think that heterosexual and homosexual people can and sometimes do use each other mutually for just pleasure, right? That's not a gay-specific thing. Anybody can do that. And, as far as whether or not there's a form of harm that's being generated there, I'm not sure I need to think about that one. But beyond that, I don't know of anything in Bibles that really addresses the issue of being a peeping Tom, for example. You could correct me, but I don't know of anything in there for that.
Let me ask you a question. I'm curious, because this is a part of my conversation that I posted in the description below with Sean McDowell, and I've never actually talked to someone who really strongly disagrees with me and kind of use this, and I'm curious how you would respond if I can ask you. Would you say that I don't know how much I want to go back into the example of this and give you all the context, but would you say it is wrong to intentionally deceive people and lie to them For example, you shake your hand in a business deal saying, I promise to do this, and then you don't do it.
Yeah, I would have a problem with that. That's unethical.
Okay. So would you agree that, now I'm taking a little bit of a step back, that actions communicate, not just words, but what we do communicate. So when I shake your hand and nod, I'm communicating something even though my mouth isn't opening up.
Yeah, in a context, sure, body language
Yeah.
does
So if you,
communicate things.
okay. So, when you give a kiss on the cheek versus a kiss on the forehead versus a kiss on the top of the head versus a kiss on the lips, those are communicating different things. And so the question here becomes, is there a way, even among consenting adults, that you can communicate something through having sex with that person, but you are not actually following through with what you're communicating? Now, this is, I guess there's more background that I do need to give a little bit, because the question is, what does sex communicate? Right? And what are we actually telling someone when we sleep with someone? What are we trying to say? And that gets into some of the points that I haven't gotten to yet in what I was going to discuss. In fact, the next point I was going to discuss. But I think the question is, if the case that I'm making is true, and that sex actually is an action, is a physical thing that communicates something to someone else, and I'm communicating that by doing the action, but then I'm not actually following through and doing that with my words or with other actions, then I'm deceiving them. I'm lying. I'm saying this is one thing I believe, but I don't actually believe it. And so the question then becomes, yeah. And so then we can say, okay, so then it's wrong to do, even if there's no physical harm done. And there still is a moral question that we should be asking on this question.
Right. So this is why, if anybody were to engage in mutually agreed upon, purely for pleasure sexual interaction between two consenting adults, that they need to have a discussion leading up to it. They shouldn't make assumptions. They should have a definitely articulated communication about what this is and what this isn't, where this is going and where it's not. And they need to be able to both understand this and acknowledge this. If they don't have that discussion and leave everything to chance, it can be very unfair to each other. Having said all that, and let's say that happens, if one person in that engagement starts reading into the experience, they think that certain things are being communicated that aren't. They simply say, oh, well, I can tell by the way this person's behaving, this means more to them than they originally indicated an interest in. And then they start to get their hopes up for it going into a relationship. Well, I think that's on them. I don't think that's the fault of the other person, because the other person articulated an agreement, and the second person is simply imagining something beyond that it wasn't part of the social contract that they articulated. And I think that's entirely their fault and their responsibility.
Yeah. So I'm curious to ask you this. And by the way, if anyone wants to dig deeper into it, the analogy I was trying to bring up was the conversation I had in the interview with Sean McDowell, where he talks about a non-biblical argument against premarital sex is that it's wrong because it's wrong to lie. And then he actually communicates that sleeping with someone and not marrying them is a form of lying to them. So that whole argument gets broken down and explained in more detail in that conversation. What I'm just kind of curious here with what you mentioned is this kind of social contract theory is it possible, in your view, to create a social contract with someone else and you both be actually doing something that is wrong? Where I am in agreement with you that this is how something is going to work, but just because we're in agreement doesn't mean the thing that we're doing is actually good. So for example, in your situation, if two consenting adults agree and say, we're only doing this for mere pleasure, that's the only purpose of this, and are we both in agreement and understand it? And the answer is yes. Well, they are still both using each other for their pleasure, which is treating people like objects for pleasure, not people to be loved. And so I would say, even though they're consensually agreeing on it and they have a social contract, what they're still doing is wrong, because they're objectifying the other person rather than loving the other person.
Yeah, I kind of see what you're saying, and it kind of reminds me of boxing. I might have went with that analogy, where they both agree to step into the ring, and it's not personal, but man, it's going to feel personal while those hits are landing, right? And so, is it wrong ethically for them to be punching each other in the face, knowing that they could be causing serious brain injuries and other problems? And I think my answer is yeah, that even when they both agree to it, it's unethical to do boxing for that reason, because you're harming each other. And I just, for me, that's how it registers. But when it comes to sexual activities like we're talking about now, I don't necessarily know that I would count that as objectifying. If there's if the psychology, if the mindset of the people engaged in this, and they've discussed it first to make sure they know that that's a shared mindset, is a celebration of personhood, not just it's the interaction of pleasure that you're providing to each other on a personal level, not as a foundation for a relationship, but as an experience in the moment between two consenting people, where it's not just about the physical sensations, it's not just about the aesthetic, it's about the shared experience and celebrating that together as just two humans that don't plan on building a life after that. While that might seem alien to you or some of the people that would follow this podcast, I can see two people being emotionally developed enough to meet each other on those terms. And then in that context, I think it would be ethical, because I don't think they're really reducing each other to the object.
So, yeah, and I think I recognize the distinction, or at least maybe the difference in our views, where we look at kind of, I think one of the points I was going to get to is or will get to soon is what is the purpose of sex, right? And again, if we start with the idea of point number one being this is God created, then he kind of designs the purpose of it. And then the question is, I may have an idea of how I want to use it and how my partner wants to use it, but if we're not using it in the way it was designed and created to be used, then we're actually going against that. And it's probably going to cause harm and destruction to it rather than cause true flourishing, which is what I'm titled this show. And so I think that's where...
sense to me. In the context, it makes sense. If we suppose an intelligent designer that it created our bodies and our sexuality for a very specific set of purposes, we should, in that context, expect that if we stray from using our bodies or connecting with other people or environment, if we stray too far from the parameters that we're designed for, we should expect consequences, which would in some form or another be a form of harm.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So I think that's where I think for a lot of the conversations that not just me and you have, but on the show, is why worldviews really matter and the presuppositions that we bring into conversations truly matter. So let me ask you this question, James. This is a point later on. I'll just bring it up now. I think it's relevant. If everyone lived the sexual ethic of Jesus, being inside being one man, one woman, becoming one flesh for one lifetime, inside the context of marriage, and everyone only had one sexual partner with their spouse, and that was it, do you think that world, in your view, would be better or worse?
Man, here's the thing. Like my experiences have tainted me a bit on this question, because while I understand the benefits on paper of a man and a woman getting together and staying together and raising children, my first father, my biological father, was just a bad man. Mm-hmm. And the man that he was replaced with when my mother remarried, he was just a different kind of horrible, but he was a really terrible human being. The abuses in that situation were just horrific. So if I could have had my wish, even just looking back in time, man, that sure would have been great if she would have just not stayed with either of them, right? So if it's a healthy enough relationship where both people are capable of at least a minimal standard of how they raise children, how they behave, then sure, the best of all possible worlds then is that they stay together and finish raising those children together.
Yeah. And so it entails a lot more than just simply one man, one woman inside the context of marriage. But then it's Ephesians chapter 5, where husbands love your wives as Christ loved the church, which he laid down his life for the church. He devoted everything to the church. Sean McDowell addresses this in his book on page 18, where here's what he says. He says, can you imagine a world where everyone lived as the sexual ethic of Jesus? He goes, isn't it good and beautiful? And he goes, the following ethic of Jesus would quite literally transform our world for the better. Here's the points that at least he raises. There would be no more victims or users of pornography. There would be no sexual exploitation, no sex trafficking, no sexual abuse. There would be no sexually transmitted diseases. There would be no rape. There would be no pregnancies outside of a loving, committed marriage. There would be no crude or disregarding or degrading sexual humor. There would be no abortions, because even unplanned for a child would be loved and cared for by his parents. There would be no pain from divorce. There'd be no men getting women pregnant and then abandoning them to take care of the kids by themselves. There would be no deadbeat dads. There'd be no prostitution. There would be no men who leave their wives for younger women, and there would be no adultery and the devastation that brings to families. And so then he asks the question, wouldn't such a world be far better than our own? And that's what I think is...
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I
But
think the idea here in the topic of this show is that I think that the sexual ethic of Jesus, if everyone actually lived consistently to husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, and be devoted to her, love her, wives, care for your husbands, love your husbands, raise your family, care for your kids, and only be with your one spouse, that actually would create a world of both personal and cultural flourishing, where sex trafficking and sexual abuse and all of these headline stories and rape and all this kind of stuff that we see constantly littered on the headlines would literally be gone.
sure,
And how can we not
on
say
paper,
that is a world of flourishing? And clearly what we have in replace of this, when we have this standard of like, do whatever you want, just as long as there's consent. And I don't know if that's your line, if it's like kind of just as long as we have consent. And one author put it, it's like, well, that's a super low bar. It's like, just don't rape people and then we're okay. But consent, as we saw with the Me Too movement, is extremely difficult to pin down, because while a woman may consent, but if the man has a position of power and she might be able to get into a higher position in the movie industry because of sleeping with this man, yeah, it's consensual, but it still is abusive and manipulative. And that's the whole nature of the Me Too movement and other issues. And so I think that when we see this idea of sexual freedom, men leaving wives and husbands and getting lives and children and getting people pregnant and going off to find a younger woman who's going to make him more happy and all this kind of stuff, we see the devastation. I mean, I've talked to students. I had a student at my school had to leave the school because of sexual exploitation. And so I think like we see how clearly the way we're doing it is not working well. And we should stop and rethink this. And then I think when you look at the biblical sexual ethic, if we actually live that way, we can clearly go, yeah, that would be amazing. A world without any of those things I just listed, that would be great. And that's the point I'm trying to say is, how can we call people to live like this to this standard?
right? I understand what you're saying. Now, when I read Bibles, I get something different out of it than you do. But if we're just talking about, wouldn't it be great to have a world where everybody behaved within those parameters? Sure, but setting aside my antinatalism, sure, I agree that these are wonderful concepts on paper. But part of the problem is that there's a very high percentage of people, adults in our society, that have a major personality disorder, whether it be narcissism or psychopathy, and they can, with the best of intentions, get into a marriage, and it just never goes well, because narcissists are pretty much programmed by their condition. They can't behave by any particular ethic that's healthy for other people. They literally can't. And I think that that's really dangerous in Christian culture and Christian churches, because because narcissists have a mask of identity. They have this superficial exterior that they project and say, acknowledge me as the mask. And that becomes really dangerous in religious systems, because then the narcissist mask becomes what they call God, right? They rest on a position of authority, that it's not right to challenge my authority because I'm the man. And this is exactly something the narcissist would say. But in the context of religion, all of a sudden it's justified to take that kind of a position, where it becomes really hard to identify a narcissist in Christian churches, because so much of the ways that they speak and relate and reason are just easily camouflaged in the context of a Christian ethos. And so I just don't think there's a solution there for that Bibles provide.
So when a narcissist, generally speaking, is defined as a very self-centered, self-important, very lack of empathy type of a person, how is that not like, this person is clearly not empathetic. They are clearly prideful. They're clearly all focused on themselves, and they're not selfless. They're not other centered. They are self-centered. How is that not, how does that blend in? How does that blend together?
Right. So, I mean, there's a reason why narcissists are attracted to Christian churches, because it gives them an easy ascent into social prestige and influence and power, because they know how to just talk the talk and walk the walk, right? They know how to, everybody looks at them and they see that they're behaving the way they're supposed to. They hear them saying the things they're supposed to say. They get into positions of influence and power within those structures of power. And they use those as an opportunity to get praise for themselves in a spiritual context. And while they're doing that, they're looking around for opportunities to exploit and manipulate people for their own advantage. And because within a Christian community and in a setting, there's, and I hate to say it, I'm not trying to be condescending, but sort of a magical thinking way. This idea that, oh, I can tell that God is working through this man because while he was leading us in prayer, or he was performing on in the band, or he was, preaching from the Bible, I felt God moving through me, right? And I know that God is moving through this man. And because people think in those terms, it creates a sense of security and safety that God is involved, God is watching, God is protecting, God is moving. And when you have this kind of a way of thinking, it makes it very easy for covert predators to move amongst the sheep, because they're cloaked in this air of God being directly involved, and people, it makes people more trusting and less critical and less wary, less guarded. And so you're going to say, yeah, go ahead and take my children camping for the weekend, and yes, go ahead and you provide counseling services for my teenage daughter, and nobody thinks twice about it, because there's this air of trust that hasn't really been earned, but is propped up as earned within a context of religion.
Yeah, I'm not saying that never happens in religion. I can just say that, number one, that's not my experience. It's the complete opposite. That people
Sure.
who have developed those sort of traits get clearly identified and recognized, and there's a very big sense of humility. In fact, my men's group on Saturday had a men's breakfast, and we talked about how do we be leaders who are humble, and our teachers and our learners, which is the exact opposite of what you're talking about here. But I think that actually what you're describing is just a human condition that we see in virtually any place in which there are positions of power. We see this in the business world. We see this in Hollywood. We see this in anywhere where people get power, and they start to use and abuse their power in negative ways. And I think that shows why we have to be able to limit power and recognize that our sinful natures, when given too much freedom, really do turn evil and abuse in those ways. And we need to have standards of accountability. And so I've seen a lot of churches, yes, where that has been done or misused, and people do get in positions of power that shouldn't be. But then there's a lot of churches that do place a lot of safeguards and structures in place to be able to weed that sort of person out, or at least if they do, recognize to be able to do that. I do think that's off topic though on what we're talking about here on a biblical view of sexuality. Is how should the church deal with power, is one thing to think through. But I think the point, and I think going back to our conversation, I forget how we initially got on this idea, but I know what it was. I think that there is what we can still have, and talking about the biblical sexual ethic is a good standard. I think that the standard still needs to be there, and recognize, okay, we may not always be able to hit that standard, but just because you have narcissists or you have people that are messed up and are not going to do that well, doesn't mean we throw out the standard and say that standard is bad, or that's something that we shouldn't strive for. Instead, I think that standard is still useful because it shows us where people have gone wrong, and to say you should love, you should care. Our love, our marriage should be selfless, not selfish. And so if you're treating it selfishly, then you're not doing it the way it was created and designed to be used. And that's why the standard is still good, even though we are not going to live up to it. That would be my main point.
Sure. Yeah, within the context, sure. We're talking about trying to create and sustain social ecosystems where people are mutually respecting and honoring and are safe for each other to engage with, and are open with where they're at in their journey. Sure, all these things are wonderful. And I love the idea of people getting together and forming a lasting bond that endures throughout their life, if they're able to do so in a healthy way. And when people aren't, that's true everywhere, right? I mean, you have plenty of, Hindus and Muslims and Christians and atheists that really aren't good at relationships for various reasons. And so what you're saying is, isn't it great to have a system that's predicated on mutual respect and connection and transparency? And my answer is sure, in principle. I think that's a wonderful idea. As far as how much success one church or one denomination has over another, or one religion has over another, I don't know what the statistics are for that. I just can't speak to it. But in principle, these are nice ideas.
Yeah. Well, hey, I appreciate the call, James. I'm going to jump back because we got 15 minutes left in the show, and I did want to talk about some of this other stuff, but I love the callers, and I wanted to give you guys some time. So thank you for calling in. I appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you.
All righty. All right. So the first point that I brought up is this idea of asking the question in biblical perspective: what is the biblical foundation? Is it a gift from God? And I think the Bible makes the case that it is a gift. Therefore, it's something that we steward, and we need to be asking what are those boundaries. And I think even the conversation that I just had with Christian James, I think points out to this fact that we need to be able to have these sort of conversations, and because everyone draws a line somewhere. Kind of goes back to the very first comment I addressed at the beginning of the show of like, well, we can't enforce our morality on other people. And it's like, but we do that all the time, where no one has a view of just do whatever you want whenever you want to do it. Almost virtually everyone will say, well, at least you need consent. Rape is wrong. Good. At least we have one boundary that says consent. And the question is, okay, is that it? Well, then most people say, well, no, but there's also the age boundary, and we don't want pedophilia. That's wrong. We don't want pederasty. That's wrong. Okay. And then we often say there's also a relational boundary. It can't be related to the person. We don't like, incest is wrong. And so we create another boundary that says that you can't be related to them, which is a good thing. And many people, not all, but many others would say, and we also have the boundary of only two people, not polygamy, not polyandry. There's people advocating for that. And so that's a growing movement. But the point here I'm trying to make is that we all create boundaries. And my whole video on how the sexual freedom has hurt us goes over this in depth and how I taught it to students, at least. But we all create boundaries somewhere. And the question then becomes, why is the boundary where you place it? And like my call with Chris, where he says, well, Christians just don't like it. I would argue the opposite. I would actually argue it's the opposite. If the Christians say it's not based on what I like and don't like, it's based on what I think that God taught. And I do punt to him. It's an appeal to authority that he is being the creator of the universe. He is the true authority, therefore, and he is the creator of our sexuality. He's the creator of our bodies. Therefore, he gets to tell us how to use our bodies. And therefore, it's not based on what I like and don't like or what I think is icky or not icky, but it's actually based on the way that God designed it to be. My challenge often to non-Christians, to secularists who believe it's just a social institution or socially constructed is, why is your boundary at 2 and not 5? Why not polygamy? And often the pushback of why that boundary there, it does become very arbitrary. Versus I think the Christian standard is less arbitrary. So that's point number one. Now I have to go quickly through my last 3 points because I do want to address this chapter and I think the 5 foundational principles. Point number 2 is this. They write, and again, we are discussing this book right here, What Do I Say When by Andrew and Christian Walker, Navigating Parents' Guide to Navigating Cultural Chaos for Children and Teens. Point number 2, they say, is that God created beings to be sexual. Therefore, sexuality is good under God's design. That we recognize in a biblical account, God makes male, female, the very next verse, and it says, now therefore go be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. And so God creating male and female, different yet compatible, is for the purpose of reproduction. And this actually in the book goes over, this is part of what scripture means by one flesh union, which is a conversation I had with Mears a couple of weeks ago, is what does the one flesh mean? And that is that men and women literally, biologically fit together to create a new human. And that's part of that one flesh union. There's emotional connection in marriage. There's a relational connection and a spiritual connection and a physical connection. And this one flesh union is all kind of encompassing. And so in a Christian view, God created all things, and this is what James and I were talking about, with an end purpose in mind. Nancy Pearcey, professor, says it this way: if nature is teleological or goal-driven, and the human body is part of nature, then it is likewise teleological. It has a built-in purpose, part of which is expressed as the moral law. A Christian ethic respects the teleology of the body and nature. This must then prompt the question, why has God designed men and women differently? The different biological sexes determine different genders, different gender roles, how males grow up to be men and potential husbands and fathers, females grow up to become women and potential wives and mothers. Genesis 1 then clearly presents this biological sex and gender identity that's found not in this cultural construction, but how God has designed and created us to be. Pearcey goes on to say this: by contrast, Christianity assigns the human body a much richer dignity and value. Humans do not need freedom from the body to discover their true authentic self. Rather, we can celebrate our embodied existence as a good gift from God. Instead of escaping the body, the goal is to live in harmony with it. And so then one of our roles as believers is to help our loved ones see the value and goodness of bodies that God created. And so I think that's one reason, going to the conversation with James, of even between consenting adults, I think that when you are placing pleasure as the ultimate goal, which is a future point I'm going to get to in a second, for sex, and therefore I find the person that gives me pleasure, you're using that person's body as a means to an end, which is for my own personal pleasure, rather than they are the end. You are the goal. I want you in a sense. And so if we are doing that, even if within consenting adults, then you are devaluing something that is valuable. You're not treating that human being with dignity. You're using them for your own purposes. And therefore, I think there's a moral question that does come into place. Number two is that God created us as sexual beings. Therefore, it's good in God's design. The third point that they address here, and I'm trying to go quickly to see if I can maybe squeeze in a caller here at the end. So if you want to see if you can squeeze in last second, you can jump in the lines there. But number three is that God's pattern for sexuality upholds the marriage of husband and wife as the exclusive grounds for sexual activity. We see this in Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus is asked about divorce, and he refers back to the created order. And so we recognize in Matthew 19, even Jesus assumes that God's created purpose for male and female is still at play and should inform our view of marriage, where he says, should we get divorced? He says, have you not heard from the very beginning? He created a male and female, and he said, the two shall become one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. And so when Jesus is asked if it was lawful to divorce, instead of pointing to the current laws to say, well, yeah, the current laws allow you to divorce, he points back to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. The two becoming one flesh. Then have you not read? He made a male and female. And so Jesus is reaffirming this male-female binary and showing that this should then be the created order should be the foundation for how marriage exists today. Christopher West, a Catholic theologian, comments on this, and he says, whatever number of gender identities the modern world may claim exist, Christ's teaching is definitive. At the beginning, the Creator made male and female, and our bodies then are created in the image of God and continue to provide a foundation for marriage today. And so this then goes to that question of, is pleasure the main purpose of sex? And if it is, then we should be living in a sense as like a hedonist. If like that is the purpose, then why not use it for that purpose? And you have people who are hedonists that live in this sort of way. The biblical view, I think, though, is different. Pleasure is not the only purpose or even the highest purpose. Sean McDowell lays this out in his book, Chasing Love. And again, we talked about it in our conversation in the interview I linked to below, that we can actually look to kind of three main purposes of sexuality and of marriage. Number one is procreation. That comes from Genesis 1:18, male and female, therefore be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. And so procreation, the fact that men and women are created biologically, and it is one of the few things I think that we actually can, we don't have the full system of. We have a full, circulatory system, a full digestive system, a full muscular system, but we have only half of a reproductive system, and that the union of one man and one woman is actually what completes the reproductive system and produces children. And so the first purpose is procreation. We see that in Genesis 1:18. We also can look at Genesis 2:24 and see the second purpose is unity. This is what unifies man and woman together within the context of marriage. The third point, and often not discussed, is that marriage and sexuality is actually a foreshadowing of heaven. That this holistic union of a complete oneness, of joining lives together and be fully loving and welcoming and supporting in all ways, to say, I love you no matter what, and I'm with you no matter what. That sort of love that people promise in their vows. And I just went to a wedding this weekend, till sickness and health and rich and poor and good and bad until death do us part. This is a union that foreshadows the greater union that we're going to have with heaven, in heaven with God and with others. This complete, known and yet loved idea. And so there's a foreshadowing of what this union can create. And I think that's why when we have sex, and I talk about this again in the interview with Sean McDowell and the thing I was trying to bring up with James, when you sleep with someone, you're saying, I love you, I'm committed to you, I'm exclusive with you. That's why if you sleep with someone and then you go sleep with someone else, it's often like, hey, you cheated on me. You're like, well, I never promised that I would only be with you. And most people go, yeah, but you slept with me. Like, yeah, I guess you didn't make that clear, but you slept with me. Like, what the heck is going on? And that is a conversation that often happens because there's ways in which we communicate with our bodies. And so this idea, and when people feel often broken, is when they can't be fully exposed and loved, and they feel like if they really knew me, they would leave me. And that's what marriage and sexuality does, is it really joins two people together in that holistic way that foreshadows heaven. Point number 4 that they address here is that God's pattern for sexuality is freeing and tied to human flourishing. That marriage and sexuality are guided, as I've been talking about this entire show, by the Christian ethic. And so this then goes into what I'm talking about with James is this is why then it is sinful, because you are going against God's original intended plan. Right? The same way, and this wouldn't be in a moral sense, but, same way in which we say is something right or wrong. What's a right or wrong way to use my coffee mug, or a right or way wrong to use this microphone? Well, the question is, what's right or wrong way to use it is, are you using it in a way it was designed to be used? This microphone was designed to be talked into. And so if I'm using it this way, you can say, yeah, that's a good use of a microphone. But if I'm using it as a baseball bat, you said that's a bad use of a microphone. Now, those are right and wrong, or good and bad, not in a moral sense, in a more, strategic sense, or more, just result-based sense. But I think the same thing cannot be applied to moral issues. That if there's actually a designed, built-in end result or designed purpose for sex by God, then to use it according to its designed purpose would be good and lead to flourishing. To use it against its purpose would be bad and lead to its destruction. And so it may not destroy us. And that's the conversation also that I was having with James of like, do we only look at physical harm, like I get sick and die? Or is there other ways of actually saying this we can see is taking people away from living the life that God has called them to live? That people through this have actually abandoned God, that people are hurt spiritually. Has this sexual freedom ever hurt people emotionally? Of course it has, right? And so there are other ways that we can hurt people, and we see this hurt coming through a misuse and abuse of sexuality. And so then the question is, if a misuse and abuse of it is wrong, then what would be a good use? What would be a right use? And that assumes that there is an end goal or an end purpose. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. As if you're saying that there's a wrong use, there's a way we can abuse it, then that presupposes that there's a right use, there's a way in which it should be used, if there's a way in which it can be used wrongly. And so then that question becomes, where do we get this teleos from? Where do we get this end goal, end purpose result from? And what is it, just our social construction and we've just made it up to be that way and it could change? Or is this a built-in designed feature? And I get there's going to be disagreement on that, but from a Christian view, and what I'm trying to lay out is the Christian biblical sexual ethic. This is a built-in designed feature. This is how God made it to be, and therefore to go against God's design, that is what sin is going against God's plan. And this is why then it's wrong, even if it doesn't create physical harm in that instance. And I think that God then built these guardrails and barriers in place, not just to control us, not just to keep people in line, but actually that we recognize that tragedies often come from misusing, misdirecting, or abusing our sexuality. And that there is a goodness and a flourishing and a beauty that comes from using it rightly. We recognize, and we can have that thought experiment that we had with James of thinking through that rightly. And so that's where Sean McDowell asked, and I asked this question, if everyone lived the biblical sexual ethic of Jesus, that husbands are loving their wives, wives are loving their husbands, they're committed to each other, they're exclusive with each other, and they only sleep with each other, and they love and raise their kids well, is that a good thing? And I think it's obvious, well, yeah, of course that's good. And then we see the abuse of that, the straying from that is when these tragedies come up. The last point here, or second to last point actually, and I'm trying to go fast, so I got 3 minutes, so I'll have to go a little over, is that rightly ordered sexuality brings glory to God. 1 Corinthians 6 talks about this, that we should glorify God with our bodies because we are bought with a price. So not only God made our bodies, but he bought our bodies at the price. And so Apostle Paul has a lot to say on this. And this is another thing that has to be considered. Apostle Paul writes in Romans 8 that we are awaiting the redemption of our bodies, right? That we see in a Christian view, God's plan is not to destroy our bodies because they've been utterly corrupted, but instead he plans to actually redeem our bodies. Paul talks about the untwisting of this, what sin is twisted, so that we can recover the true glory, the splendor, the immeasurable value of the body. In another letter in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul talks about that our bodies are not meant for us, but are meant for the Lord. Or our bodies are a temple of the Holy Spirit, 1 Corinthians 6 as well. They're called to glorify God with our bodies. And so our bodies are designed and created to be oriented towards God and used for him. And therefore, if we are ordering them away from God and not using them for him, that is where the wrongness comes in. And again, we may disagree, but the question is, well, but is that the truth? And again, if you don't believe that God created us, then it's not a sin. But in a Christian view, we should at least all agree on that, like, yeah, if God did create us and order our bodies rightly, then it would be wrong to go against that. And so then that becomes the more fundamental question is, does God exist and did he create us this way? And so it's not spiritually irrelevant. Our bodies have a purpose found in service to God. And he has a plan to use our whole self and our bodies included. in 1 Corinthians 6, we also see Paul uses you and your body interchangeably. When people, and I think this is a key thing to think of this conversation to help us think well. When people hurt your body, they've hurt you. When you hurt someone's body, you hurt them. And so we recognize it's not just damaged property, but you have violated that person, right? What you do to someone's body, you do to them. And we also see a difference between forcing someone to go watch a movie with you than forcing someone to sleep with you. We recognize it's not just for, doing a physical activity. If sleeping with someone is just simply doing a physical activity, like playing basketball with someone, forcing someone to play basketball, it's like maybe you're a bad friend, but that's it. Forcing them to sleep with you, you're going to jail now, right? We clearly see a distinction and a deeper emotional and physical connection when it comes to our sexuality than simply just another physical activity. This then leads to the last point that I did want to address here, and that they raise in the book, is that the gospel affirms the creational order for sexuality and marriage and offers pathways for us to live in sexual holiness. And I want to address a few things here. Number one is this: the gospel has not left us dead in our sins, right? But the beauty of the gospel is that while this world is in a constant state of decay and while there's sin covering and filling our world, Christ has come to actually redeem this world and redeem our bodies. The gospel is not just good news for our souls. The gospel is good news for our sexuality. There's a glorious physical future awaiting us, right? The resurrection of Jesus brings life to our mortal bodies. And then when we talk about in Romans 8 that we groan inwardly awaiting adoption for as sons and adoption as redemption for our bodies. Beth Felker Jones writes this: either gender bodies are a problem to be wiped away in the redemption, or they are an intrinsic part of the nature in which God, in making all things new, will take up into grace. Our secular culture attempts to solve our experiences only with temporary solutions, but the one that ultimately cannot heal our brokenness. It's Christ and his restoration that will heal us for all of eternity. Now, why it's also not just cultural flourishing, but also I think personal flourishing, is that the gospel is not just to restore our bodies, but also focuses on redeeming our desires. This is also what James talked about, that some people just don't have the desire to murder. And so how many people do I want to murder? Well, 0. Well, that's wonderful. When people don't desire evil, we go, yes, that's great. But when we desire wrong and the only thing stopping us is, well, there's a rule and I can't do it, then we go, man, that's a brokenness. And we hope that our desires are actually changed and reordered. Well, this is also part of the gospel, and how the gospel brings healing is that it actually redeems our desires. It's not a repressive thing. It's a redeeming thing. Well, it changes us. Christianity is not just a long list of don'ts. Don't do this. Don't do this. It's pointing us to a better yes. We also recognize that God's plan of restoration is good for our world as well as us, right? This is presupposing a lot in the Christian view, but believing that God is good, that he created, that he designed us for good things, then following him is never going to be dehumanizing or repressive, right? His plan is going to include what is best for us, even though we may not see it that way in the moment. Just like when I don't give my kids sugar last night, I did not give him an extra piece of cookie because it's almost bedtime, and I only gave him 3 little small pieces, not 5 like he really wanted. He thought that was dad being the worst, that I am taking away this good, wonderful thing from him, but he just doesn't know better. And there's a reason I'm not giving him more cookie right before bedtime. And so I think it can be helpful for us to keep this in mind when trying to persuade others of the Christian view, that hopefully we're not just saying what's true, but we're actually trying to point to the beauty of it. We're trying to tell the story of let's use our imagination to actually imagine true things. Like imagine a world like this, where we are seeing what is good, true, and beautiful together. Finally, in all of this, please hear something I've said many times and I think is relevant here. People are not the enemy. They're the goal, right? As I mentioned at the beginning, a transgender male, Austin Hartke, shares that when people began wanting a relationship with Austin, it helped them move from thinking about transgender people as an issue to seeing us as human beings. I think that's what we have to recognize, is that when we're engaging with human beings who are created by God, fallen in need of being redeemed, we need to look at this as physical, but also spiritual world. It should change how we view people, that they are human beings, inherently valuable, worthy of dignity. They're not the enemy to be destroyed. They are people to be loved. And that is why we have to, I think, step back and try to think about this in a whole biblical framework. And I think that, look, I have other videos on this. If we want to talk about it later in another show, we can. And I'm happy to look at your comments. But I think when you look at sociological studies, when you read headlines, we see immense amounts of sexual brokenness. And the question is, can sex education in schools alone fix that? Or is there actually a deeper brokenness in which we want to educate people sexually, but we also want to point them to a better way of doing it, rather than saying, as I've had students frequently come back to my classroom, they go to college, they come back and they're like, look, in our freshman orientation, all they told us was just consent. And one student came back and said they stood up and chanted, consent, consent, consent. That's it. Again, can we not all agree? That is an extremely low bar. If we're saying, do what you want, just don't rape anybody. No, it's a very negative ethic. Just don't hurt people. We're missing the, how do we love? How do we value? How do we cherish? How do we long for this person? How do we actually just enjoy this person, not because of what they give us, but because they are worth being with. They are valuable. They are worthy just to be loved for them, not what I get from them. And I think hopefully we can all recognize this is a good thing. How do we get there? How do we make sense of this? How do we ground this in a way that's not arbitrary, not based on personal preferences and feelings, but a way in which we can actually have an objective reason to say this is the way it should be? And I do think that Christianity, and I know this is extremely controversial, and I've had lots of shows on like morality, and I'm going to talk about that more in future shows on can you have morality without God? I believe you can't. That while you can be moral people and while you can do good, you cannot have a justification, a foundation for that moral goodness. I think the same is true here. That when we see sexuality lived out well, that leads to flourishing, it is often because they're treating people in a way that is consistent while they may not agree with a biblical sexual ethic. So anyways, there's a little bit there. If you want to chat further on this, comment in the comment section, come over to the Instagram channel and let's continue this conversation, because these are things that are worth thinking about. This is what we need to think well about. And these are things that matter and impact people's lives. Again, there's other conversations on this topic of sexuality in the description below on YouTube. If you're not there, I have conversations with Christopher Yuan, Sean McDowell, and then myself walking through this as well. Next week is going to be on the Leibnizian cosmological argument from this book, and then the next two chapters on the Kalam cosmological argument and the teleological argument. I also have the Worldview series discussing biblical and theological studies, as well as philosophy next month. And look, as with the show every week, I want to take your calls. I want to take your questions. I want to engage with the things that you are thinking. And so, if you think that what I'm saying is not true, I want to hear that, because look, I hope that what I'm trying to model here and what I want to do and communicate is that we need to be people who love truth and are willing to listen to the other side, listen in a way that we think that I could be wrong, and that there's something I could learn from you. And that's why I want to listen to you well and engage with these ideas well. And then hopefully adjust our thinking, because everyone wins when you engage in good, thoughtful, respectful conversations. You either see where the other side is lacking and wanting, and you become more firm and strong in your convictions, or you actually see where actually maybe the other side has some points and where your views are wrong that you need to give up. Either way, we grow in our understanding of truth and what is good, and hopefully get better and have better conversations. So that's my goal. That's my hope on this show. And that's what I try to do each week. And so hopefully it's done, and hopefully it's enjoyable for you to watch and for you to engage with. Thank you for everyone who is here. Thank you for Chris and James for calling in. I appreciate it. And let's keep the conversation going throughout the week. But I'm going to see you live here again next week, Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Pacific time, talking about the Leibnizian cosmological argument and then taking your questions. Until then, have a wonderful rest of your week, everybody, and continue thinking deeply about these things, because they are worth thinking about. See you later. Have a good one.